I am Julius Malema, and before I begin this story, I want to tell you something that many people may find surprising. Some of the most important moments in a person's life do not happen in front of cameras. They do not happen during major speeches. They do not happen while thousands of people are cheering or criticizing. Instead, they happen in quiet conversations. They happen when two people sit across from one another and speak honestly about life, purpose, faith, and the questions that cannot be answered by politics alone. For many years, the public has known me as a political leader. People have watched me debate national issues, challenge powerful institutions, and speak passionately about justice, equality, and the future of Africa. Some support me, some disagree with me. That is the nature of public life. But there is another side of every public figure that rarely becomes part of the headlines. There are moments of reflection, moments of doubt, moments when a person asks himself whether he's truly focused on the things that matter most. That is why I decided to share this story. Not because it is about politics, not because it is about influence, and certainly not because it is about public recognition. I am sharing it because it reminded me that a single conversation can change the way we understand ourselves. This story took place toward the end of the year 2025. The location was the Gallagher Convention Center in Midrand, Johannesburg. A gathering had brought together community leaders, business leaders, and religious leaders from different backgrounds. I attended expecting discussions about leadership, social challenges, and the future of our communities. What I did not expect was that I would spend part of that day speaking with Pastor Enoch Adeboye. Many of you know his name. He is the General Overseer of the Redeemed Christian Church of God, a Christian movement that has millions of members around the world. His influence reaches far beyond Africa. His voice has guided people for decades. When I was informed that he would also be attending the event, I felt curious. Not nervous, not intimidated, simply curious. At that point in my life, I carried more questions than answers. Questions about leadership, questions about responsibility, questions about what keeps a person standing when pressure comes from every direction. I had no idea that before the day was over, I would say something about Christ that would lead to a response neither of us expected. And looking back now, I believe that moment became the beginning of a journey I could not yet see. What started as an ordinary meeting soon became a conversation that stayed with me long after the event had ended. And it all began with a handshake that was never part of the plan. The month was November 2025. The Gallagher Convention Center in Midrand was filled with people from many different backgrounds. Community organizers were exchanging ideas. Business leaders were discussing economic opportunities. Religious leaders were speaking about hope, morality, and the challenges facing modern society. The atmosphere was serious, but there was also a sense of expectation. South Africa, like many nations, was facing difficult questions. Economic pressure was affecting millions of families. Communities were searching for stability. Many people were wondering what kind of leadership would be needed in the years ahead. I arrived expecting a normal day of meetings and discussions. My schedule was already full. There were conversations planned with organizers, community representatives, and several guests attending the event. Then someone informed me that Pastor Enoch Adeboye would also be present. I paused for a moment when I heard his name. Of course, I knew who he was. Across Africa and far beyond its borders, Pastor Adeboye was recognized as one of the most influential Christian leaders in the world. Millions listened to his teachings. Millions respected his spiritual leadership. Whether a person belonged to his church or not, his impact was impossible to ignore. My first thought was simple. I wondered what kind of person he would be away from the stage. Public figures are often very different in private settings. People see speeches, interviews, and public appearances. They rarely see the human being behind them. As the event continued, I attended several sessions and met many participants. At some point during the afternoon, one of the organizers approached me. He mentioned that Pastor Adeboye had a short break between engagements and would be greeting several guests in a private reception area. I was invited to join. Nothing about the invitation seemed particularly important at the time. It felt like one of many introductions that happen during large gatherings. When I entered the reception area, I immediately noticed how calm the atmosphere was. There was no crowd pushing forward, no cameras flashing, no dramatic entrance, just a small group of people speaking quietly. Then I saw Pastor Adeboye. He was standing near a table, greeting guests one by one. When my turn came, we shook hands. The exchange lasted only a few seconds. He smiled warmly and welcomed me. I introduced myself, although he clearly already knew who I was. We exchanged a few polite words about the event and the people attending. What struck me immediately was how attentive he seemed. Many influential people speak while already thinking about the next conversation. He seemed fully present, focused, interested. Even during those first moments, I sensed something unusual. There was no attempt to impress anyone, no effort to dominate the room, just genuine attention. After a few minutes, someone suggested that we continue talking in a quieter area nearby. The original plan was simple. We would spend perhaps 15 minutes together before returning to our separate schedules. At least that was what everyone expected. I certainly expected it. At that moment, I believed I was about to have a brief conversation with a respected religious leader and then move on with the rest of my day. I had no idea that the discussion was about to become far more personal than either of us anticipated. And I certainly did not know that a single question would soon force me to think about my life in a way I had not considered for a very long time. We moved into a private reception room away from the main conference hall. The noise from the event faded almost completely once the door closed behind us. A few staff members remained nearby, but the setting was quiet enough for an honest conversation. I expected a brief exchange about leadership, community development, or current events. Instead, the discussion took a direction I did not anticipate. Pastor Adeboye began by asking simple questions. He did not start with theology. He did not begin by talking about religion. He asked about life. He asked about responsibility. He asked what it was like carrying the weight of public leadership year after year. At first, I gave the kind of answers most public figures give. I spoke about the demands of leadership. I spoke about serving people. I spoke about the need to remain focused despite criticism. But as the conversation continued, I found myself becoming more honest. The truth was that leadership often feels much heavier than people imagine. Many people see speeches. They see headlines. They see public appearances. What they do not see are the difficult decisions made behind closed doors. They do not see the pressure of knowing that every statement may be examined, criticized, or misunderstood. They do not see the emotional burden that comes from carrying the hopes of people who are struggling. I shared some of these realities with him. I spoke about the political environment in South Africa. I spoke about the frustration many citizens feel regarding unemployment, poverty, and inequality. At the time, the unemployment rate remained above 30%. Millions of people were searching for opportunities. Many communities felt forgotten. At the same time, trust in many institutions had weakened. People wanted answers. They wanted change. They wanted leaders they could believe in. Those expectations create enormous pressure. I explained that criticism comes from every direction. If you act, some people disagree. If you remain silent, others accuse you of doing nothing. Leadership often requires making decisions that satisfy nobody completely. Throughout this conversation, Pastor Adeboye did something I found remarkable. He listened, truly listened. He did not interrupt. He did not rush to provide solutions. He did not try to turn the discussion into a sermon. He simply allowed me to speak. The more I spoke, the more I realized how rarely that happens. Many conversations are actually competitions. People wait for their turn to speak. Few people genuinely listen. Pastor Adeboye listened with patience. When I finished describing some of the pressures that come with public life, he remained silent for several seconds. Then he asked a question. It sounded simple. In fact, it was so simple that at first I almost dismissed it. He looked directly at me and said, "Julius, what keeps you standing when everything around you is shaking?" That was it. One sentence, one question, no long explanation, no lecture, just a question. Yet something about it stopped me immediately. I had spoken publicly thousands of times. I had debated opponents. I had answered journalists. I had responded to critics. But I was not sure I had ever seriously asked myself that question. What truly keeps a person standing when circumstances become unstable? What gives strength when criticism grows louder? What provides direction when uncertainty increases? For a moment, I did not answer. I simply sat there thinking. The room became unusually quiet. Outside, the conference continued as normal. Inside, however, it felt as though everything had slowed down, because I knew the answer I was about to give would not be political. It would not be strategic. It would be personal. And that answer would lead our conversation into territory neither of us had planned to explore. What happened next surprised even me. For several moments after Pastor Adeboye asked his question, I remained silent. I was not searching for a clever answer. I was not trying to impress anyone in the room. I was trying to be honest. The older I become, the more I realize that some questions deserve honesty more than speed. This was one of those questions. Eventually, I looked at him and began to speak. I told him that throughout my life, I had encountered many different ideas about faith. I had met people who spoke about religion every day. I had also met people who never spoke about it at all. But whenever I thought about Christ, one image consistently came to mind. I told him that I saw Jesus as a symbol of justice, mercy, courage, and sacrifice. Not simply as a religious figure discussed in sermons, but as someone whose actions carried meaning far beyond the walls of a church. As I spoke, I found myself reflecting on lessons I had learned years earlier. Like many people who grew up in Africa, I was exposed to biblical stories from a young age. Some lessons remained with me long after childhood. Others became more meaningful as I grew older. The story that always captured my attention was not one about power. It was not about wealth. It was not about influence. It was about the way Christ treated people whom society often ignored, the poor, the forgotten, the rejected, the people others considered unimportant. I explained to Pastor Adeboye that this was one reason I had always been drawn to the teachings of Jesus. Throughout the gospel accounts, Christ repeatedly stood beside people who had little status and little power. He challenged those who abused authority. He confronted hypocrisy. He showed compassion to people others preferred to avoid. That message had always spoken to me, not because it was politically useful, not because it was popular, but because it revealed a vision of human dignity that transcended social position. As I continued speaking, I noticed that Pastor Adeboye remained completely focused. He listened without interruption. There was no attempt to correct me, no attempt to redirect the conversation, only attentive listening. I admitted something else as well. I told him that many people would probably be surprised to hear me speak openly about faith. Public perception often creates simple versions of complex human beings. People place leaders into categories: political, religious, conservative, progressive, supporter, opponent. Yet human beings are rarely that simple. Every person carries questions, convictions, doubts, experiences, and beliefs that may never appear in public discussions. I explained that faith for me had never been about appearing religious. It had always been connected to deeper questions about justice, purpose, and responsibility. Questions about how people should treat one another. Questions about what kind of society we should build. Questions about whether leadership exists to serve people or to serve itself. The more I spoke, the more personal the conversation became. At one point, I told him something I had rarely expressed so directly. I said that one of the most remarkable things about Christ was that he never seemed concerned with impressing powerful people. Again and again, he focused on truth, even when truth was uncomfortable, even when it created opposition, even when it came at a personal cost. That kind of courage had always fascinated me, not because it was easy, but because it was rare. When I finished speaking, I expected Pastor Adeboye to respond immediately. Instead, he remained quiet. His expression suggested he was thinking carefully about every word. The atmosphere in the room had changed. What began as a conversation about leadership had become something much deeper. And without realizing it, I was about to say something that would cause everyone nearby to stop and listen. The next few minutes would become one of the most memorable moments of that entire day. After speaking about what Christ represented to me, I felt something unusual happen in the room. The conversation had already become more personal than I expected, but now it seemed to be moving towards something even deeper. No one was rushing to speak. No one was checking a phone. No one appeared distracted. The atmosphere had become intensely focused. I looked at Pastor Adeboye and continued sharing what was on my mind. At that point, I was no longer speaking as a politician. I was speaking as a person trying to understand what faith truly means in the real world. Over the years, I had observed many different expressions of religion. I had seen faith inspire remarkable acts of kindness. I had seen churches support struggling communities. I had seen ordinary believers sacrifice their own comfort to help people in need. But I had also noticed something else. There often seemed to be a gap between what people professed and how they lived. That observation was not limited to any one denomination, country, or group. It was a human reality. And so I shared a thought that had stayed with me for years. I said that many people know a great deal about religion, but far fewer truly understand the message that Christ taught. The words came naturally. They were not prepared. They were not part of a speech. They were simply what I believed. Then I added something that would change the mood of the conversation completely. I said, many people follow Christ in name, but very few truly walk the path he showed. The moment those words left my mouth, the room became still. Not dramatic, not uncomfortable, just silent. A silence that seemed to invite reflection. Several people seated nearby who had previously been engaged in their own quiet conversations suddenly turned their attention toward us. I could sense that they had heard what I said. Perhaps they were surprised. Perhaps they agreed. Perhaps they disagreed. I could not tell, but I knew they were listening. The interesting thing was that I was not criticizing anyone. I was speaking about a challenge that applies to all of us. It is easy to admire principles. It is much harder to live them. It is easy to praise compassion. It is harder to show compassion when someone has wronged you. It is easy to speak about justice. It is harder to pursue justice when doing so comes with personal sacrifice. It is easy to celebrate truth. It is harder to tell the truth when the truth is unpopular. That was the point I was trying to make. The teachings of Christ are not difficult because they are complicated. They are difficult because they demand something from us. They challenge the human tendency toward selfishness. They ask people to think beyond themselves. They require humility. And humility is not something that comes naturally to most of us. As I continued speaking, nobody interrupted. Most of all, Pastor Adeboye did not interrupt. He simply listened. His eyes remained fixed on me, not in judgment, not in disagreement, but with genuine attention. That made me continue. I spoke about how many societies today are searching for solutions to enormous problems. Economic inequality, violence, corruption, division, distrust. Yet many of the values needed to confront those challenges, honesty, responsibility, compassion, courage, are the very values that Christ emphasized. The room remained quiet. By then, it felt as though everyone present understood that this was no longer a casual discussion. Something meaningful was taking place. Finally, I stopped speaking. For the first time in several minutes, no one said anything. The silence that followed seemed much longer than it actually was. A few seconds can feel like several minutes when people are reflecting deeply. I remember looking around the room. No one appeared eager to break the silence. Everyone seemed to be thinking, including me. Then I turned back toward Pastor Adeboye. He had not spoken a single word during my entire reflection, but the expression on his face suggested that he was about to say something I would remember for a very long time. What happened next was completely unexpected, and it became the first true turning point in the story. For several seconds after I finished speaking, Pastor Adeboye remained silent. No one in the room moved. No one seemed eager to interrupt the moment. The stillness itself felt meaningful. I remember thinking that perhaps he was carefully considering how to respond, or perhaps he was deciding whether response was even necessary. Then he slowly nodded. His expression was calm, not surprised, not emotional, just thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. He did not begin by discussing theology. He did not quote a long passage of scripture. He did not challenge anything I had said. Instead, he shared a lesson he had learned after many decades of ministry. He said that one of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming that truth always comes from the places they expect. According to him, life often works differently. Sometimes the most important truths are spoken by people others least expect to hear them from. Sometimes wisdom appears in unexpected conversations. Sometimes the person delivering the message is not the person the audience imagined. Those words immediately caught my attention because I understood exactly what he meant. Public life creates assumptions. People build opinions about others based on headlines, speeches, political affiliations, or public images. After enough years, those assumptions become difficult to challenge. People stop listening. They believe they already know everything they need to know about someone. Pastor Adeboye seemed to understand that reality very well. He looked at me and said something I have never forgotten. He said that faith is not primarily about labels. It is not about titles. It is not about public identity. It is not about what people call themselves. Faith, he explained, is about transformation. It is about what happens inside a person. It is about whether beliefs actually change the way someone thinks, speaks, and treats others. As he spoke, I found myself reflecting on those words. Transformation. The word stayed in my mind. In politics, people often focus on systems, policies, institutions, structure. Those things matter. But Pastor Adeboye was speaking about something different. He was speaking about personal transformation, the kind that cannot be measured by elections, positions, or achievements, the kind that takes place within the human heart. He then shared several stories from his years of ministry. Without mentioning names, he described people who had arrived broken by disappointment, addiction, anger, or hopelessness. Many of them had exhausted every solution they could find. Some had lost families. Some had lost opportunities. Some had lost faith in themselves. Yet, over time, many experienced profound changes, not because their circumstances immediately improved, not because every problem disappeared, but because their understanding of themselves and their purpose changed. Listening to those stories, I began to think about my own journey. I thought about the decisions that had shaped my life, the victories, the failures, the lessons learned through struggle, the moments when criticism felt overwhelming, the moments when determination carried me forward. Like anyone who has spent years in public life, I had accumulated experiences that shaped the person I became. But Pastor Adebo's words caused me to ask a deeper question. What kind of person was I becoming through those experiences? Not what was I accomplishing, not what was I achieving, but who was I becoming? That distinction mattered more than I realized. Then he said something that struck me with unexpected force. He said that leadership is not ultimately measured by the number of people who follow you. It is measured by the lives that become better because you existed. I immediately recognized the weight of that statement. Because leadership can easily become focused on influence, numbers, recognition, visibility. Yet his definition pointed somewhere else entirely, toward service, toward impact, toward responsibility. The room remained quiet as he spoke. Everyone seemed aware that this was no ordinary exchange. What began as a brief introduction had become a conversation about purpose itself. And at that moment, I realized something else. The meeting that had been scheduled for only a few minutes had already lasted far longer than anyone expected. Yet neither of us seemed interested in ending it. In fact, the most important part of the conversation was still ahead, because the discussion was about to move beyond faith alone and into the future of leadership, forgiveness, and the next generation of Africa. By that point, neither Pastor Adeboye nor I were paying much attention to the clock. The meeting had originally been expected to last around 15 minutes. That was the plan given to the organizers. A brief greeting, a short conversation. Then both of us would return to our separate commitments. But plans have a way of changing when a discussion becomes meaningful. Without realizing it, nearly an hour had passed. Several times, staff members quietly appeared near the doorway. Each time, they seemed reluctant to interrupt. They could sense that something important was unfolding. The conversation had moved far beyond introductions. It had moved beyond religion as people often define it. It had become a discussion about responsibility, purpose, and the future. One topic naturally led to another. We spoke about leadership, not the public image of leadership, but the reality of it. The burden that comes with knowing that your decisions affect other people. The challenge of remaining faithful to your principles when circumstances encourage compromise. The temptation to seek popularity instead of truth. Both of us understood that leadership, whether political or spiritual, carries enormous responsibility. People place their hopes in leaders, and whenever people place hope in someone, that person must be careful not to betray that trust. From there, our discussion shifted toward community. We talked about the struggles facing many African societies. The challenges were different from country to country, but certain themes appeared everywhere. Poverty, unemployment, educational inequality, violence, corruption, a growing sense of frustration among ordinary citizens. Many communities were searching for direction. Many young people were searching for opportunity. And many families were wondering what kind of future awaited the next generation. At one point, Pastor Adeboye spoke about forgiveness. That topic surprised me. Forgiveness is not usually discussed in political conversations. Politics often focuses on conflict, competition, disagreement. Yet forgiveness is essential for any society hoping to heal from division. He explained that forgiveness does not mean ignoring wrongdoing. It does not mean pretending injustice never happened. Instead, it means refusing to allow bitterness to become your identity. Those words stayed with me because every leader faces criticism. Every leader faces opposition. Every leader encounters people who misunderstand their intentions. The longer a person remains in public life, the greater the temptation to carry resentment. Yet, resentment rarely helps anyone move forward. As the conversation continued, we eventually began discussing young people. This subject seemed especially important to both of us. Africa is home to the youngest population of any continent in the world. Hundreds of millions of young people will shape Africa's future during the coming decades. Their energy, creativity, and determination have the potential to transform entire nations. But potential alone is not enough. Young people also need opportunity. They need education. They need mentorship. They need leaders who believe in them. I remember Pastor Adeboye speaking with great hope about the next generation. Despite all the challenges facing Africa, he remained optimistic. He believed that young Africans possessed enormous potential to build a better future. I shared that optimism. Throughout my own experience, I had met countless young people who were intelligent, hardworking, and deeply committed to improving their communities. The problem was never a lack of talent. The problem was often a lack of opportunity. As we explored these ideas, I gradually realized something important. The conversation was no longer primarily about faith. Faith remained part of it. But now we were discussing something broader. We were discussing how beliefs influence action, how values shape leadership, how character affects decisions, how hope influences the future of entire communities. In other words, we were discussing the practical consequences of what people truly believe. That realization changed the way I viewed the entire meeting. What had started as an unexpected introduction had become a masterclass in reflection, not because anyone was lecturing, not because anyone was trying to win an argument, but because two people from different backgrounds were asking honest questions about life and responsibility. As valuable as that discussion was, the most personal part of the experience had not yet arrived. Because before the day ended, Pastor Adeboye would share something that forced me to look inward and examine my own life more carefully than I had in years. And that reflection would leave a lasting mark on me long after the conference was over. As our conversation continued, Pastor Adeboye began sharing stories from his many decades in ministry. These were not stories about famous people. They were not stories about large gatherings or impressive achievements. They were stories about ordinary individuals, people whose lives had changed in ways they never expected, people who had once believed they were beyond hope, people who thought their mistakes would define them forever. Again and again, he described how faith had transformed lives from the inside out, not overnight, not through magic, not through sudden perfection, but through gradual change, one decision at a time, one step at a time, one act of courage at a time. As I listened, I realized that the stories were not really about religion alone. They were about human beings. They were about the possibility of growth, the possibility of redemption, the possibility that a person can become more than the worst thing that has happened to them. That idea stayed with me because every leader eventually spends time reflecting on his own journey. Public life moves quickly. There are meetings to attend, problems to solve, decisions to make. Yet every so often, life creates a moment when a person is forced to stop and look inward. For me, this conversation became one of those moments. While Pastor Adeboye spoke, I found myself thinking about the road that had brought me to that room. I thought about my early years, I thought about the experiences that shaped my convictions. I thought about the challenges that tested my resolve. I thought about the people who had believed in me when success seemed uncertain. And I thought about the mistakes I had made along the way. Every human being carries memories that remain invisible to everyone else. Moments of triumph, moments of regret, moments that changed the direction of life. Sitting there, I found myself revisiting many of those memories. Then a series of questions began forming in my mind, questions that seemed simple but felt increasingly important. What is real success? Is success measured by recognition, by influence, by wealth, by power, or is it measured by something deeper? Something that remains after titles disappear and public attention moves elsewhere? The more I thought about those questions, the less certain I became of the answers I would have given earlier in life. For many years, society has taught people to pursue visible achievements, to pursue status, to pursue victory, to pursue influence. There is nothing inherently wrong with achievement, but achievement alone does not guarantee meaning. History is filled with powerful individuals who accumulated influence but left behind very little that truly benefited others. At the same time, history is also filled with ordinary people whose kindness, courage, and integrity transformed countless lives. That realization led to another question. What is the greatest legacy a leader can leave behind? Is it a speech, a policy, a movement, a position, or is it the impact made on the lives of other human beings? The question lingered in my thoughts because every leader, whether political, spiritual, or community-based, eventually leaves something behind. The real question is whether that legacy strengthens people or merely impresses them. Pastor Deboy seemed to understand this instinctively. Throughout our discussion, he repeatedly returned to the idea that leadership is service, not service as a slogan, not service as a campaign message, but service as a daily commitment to improving the lives of others. The more I listened, the more I understood why so many people respected him. His influence did not appear to come from authority alone. It came from consistency, from living according to principles that had guided him for decades. By then, the conference around us had become almost irrelevant. The noise outside the room felt distant. My attention was entirely focused on the conversation. Something inside me was shifting, not dramatically, not suddenly, but unmistakably. I was beginning to see leadership through a different lens, not merely as the ability to influence events, but as the responsibility to leave people better than you found them. That idea stayed with me long after the meeting ended. And before the day was over, I would discover that I was not the only person affected by our conversation. Because what happened next would take the discussion beyond that private room and into a public setting where others would hear the message as well. And their reaction would surprise me more than anything that had happened so far. When our conversation finally came to an end, nearly an hour had passed. Neither Pastor Deboye nor I had planned for that. What began as a brief introduction had become one of the most thoughtful discussions I had experienced in a long time. As we stood and prepared to return to the main event, I carried several ideas with me. Some of them challenged assumptions I had held. Others simply reminded me of truths I already knew but had not reflected on deeply enough. I expected the experience to remain private. I assumed it would become one of those meaningful conversations that stays in your memory but is never discussed publicly. However, events unfolded differently. Later that day, I was invited to address a smaller gathering connected to the conference. The audience included community leaders, business representatives, church members, young professionals, and several event participants who had remained after the larger sessions had concluded. The atmosphere was informal. This was not a major public speech. There were no large television crews, no elaborate stage. no prepared political address. Because of that, I felt free to speak openly. As I stood before the group, my thoughts returned to the conversation I had just shared with Pastor Adeboye. Without planning to do so, I began talking about some of the ideas we had discussed. I spoke about leadership. I spoke about responsibility. I spoke about the difference between public success and personal integrity. Then I returned to the subject that had created such reflection in our earlier conversation. I spoke about Christ. More specifically, I spoke about what had always impressed me most about him. I told the audience that one of the most powerful aspects of Christ's example was his commitment to people who were often overlooked. The poor, the vulnerable, the forgotten, those with little power and little influence. I explained that true leadership should never lose sight of such people. A society should ultimately be judged by how it treats those who have the least. As I continued, I repeated something very similar to what I had shared privately with Pastor Adeboye. I said that many people know religious language. Many people know religious traditions. Many people know how to identify with the faith community. But the real challenge is living according to the values we claim to believe. The room became noticeably attentive. Some people nodded. Others sat quietly listening. I could tell that the message resonated with many of them. Not because it was complicated, but because it was familiar. Most people understand the difference between claiming a principle and practicing it. The challenge is applying that understanding consistently. When the session ended, several attendees approached me. Some were older, some were much younger, some came from religious backgrounds, others did not. Yet many of them expressed similar thoughts. They appreciated hearing a discussion about faith that focused on character rather than labels, on action rather than appearance, on responsibility rather than reputation. One conversation after another reinforced the same lesson. People are hungry for authenticity. They are tired of performance. They are tired of division. They are tired of hearing principles discussed without seeing them practiced. A young attendee told me that the comments about Christ's concern for ordinary people reminded him why he had originally become involved in community service. Another person said that the discussion challenged him to think differently about leadership. Several others simply thanked me for speaking honestly. Those reactions surprised me, not because I believed the message was extraordinary, but because I realized it had connected with more people than I expected. The ideas that emerged from a private conversation were now encouraging broader reflection. That realization stayed with me because it demonstrated something important. People may disagree about politics. They may disagree about policies. They may disagree about ideology, but many still respond to conversations about integrity, compassion, purpose, and service. Those values speak a language that crosses many boundaries. As I left the event later that evening, I found myself thinking not about the speeches that had been delivered or the schedules that had been followed. Instead, I kept thinking about the conversation with Pastor Adeboye. At the time, I did not fully understand its significance. I only knew that something about it felt different. It would take several months before I understood why. And when I finally did, I realized that the most important change had not happened around me. It had happened within me. That realization would become the final chapter of this story. And it would answer the question that had remained in my mind ever since that unexpected meeting in Johannesburg. Several months passed after that meeting in Johannesburg. Life returned to its normal rhythm. There were political responsibilities, public appearances, meetings, travel, debate, the same demands that accompany leadership year after year. From the outside, nothing appeared dramatically different. My position had not changed. My circumstances had not changed. the challenges facing society had not suddenly disappeared. South Africa still faced serious economic pressures. Communities still struggled with unemployment, inequality, and uncertainty. The world itself continued facing division, conflict, and instability. Yet as time passed, I realized that something had changed. The change was not external. It was internal. The conversation with Pastor Adeboye kept returning to my thoughts. Not every day, not every week, but often enough that I could not ignore it. I found myself revisiting the questions we discussed. Questions about leadership, questions about responsibility, questions about faith, questions about what truly matters when public recognition fades away. The older I become, the more I understand that some conversations continue long after the people involved have gone their separate ways. Their words remain with you. They challenge you. They force you to examine assumptions you once accepted without question. That conversation became one of those experiences. Looking back, I realized that the most important lesson was not about politics. It was not about public influence. It was not about winning arguments. It was about perspective. I began thinking more carefully about the relationship between faith and responsibility. Not faith as a label, not faith as a public identity, but faith as something that influences how a person treats others, how a person responds to power, how a person handles success, how a person behaves when no audience is watching. I also found myself thinking differently about Christ. Not because I had suddenly discovered something entirely new, but because our conversation helped me appreciate certain truths more deeply. The example of Christ was never primarily about status. It was never about prestige. It was never about public approval. Again and again, his life pointed toward service, compassion, courage, and sacrifice. Those values remain relevant regardless of political affiliation, nationality, or background. And perhaps that is why his message continues speaking to people across generations. The meeting with Pastor Adeboye did not change the world overnight. It did not solve Africa's challenges. It did not eliminate poverty. It did not remove injustice. No single conversation could accomplish those things. But it changed something equally important. It changed the way I thought about the role faith can play in shaping character. It reminded me that leadership without integrity is fragile, that influence without purpose is empty, and that success without service ultimately leaves little behind. After that conversation, I spent a great deal of time reflecting on what I had said and on what our world is experiencing today. I realized that despite our differences, people everywhere are searching for many of the same things. They are searching for dignity. They are searching for justice. They are searching for truth. And they are searching for hope. During my years in public life, I have seen powerful systems rise and fall. I have seen grand promises fail to improve the lives of ordinary people. I have seen institutions gain trust and lose it again. And I have learned that no nation can become truly strong while large numbers of its people remain trapped by poverty, fear, or injustice. That is why I believe real change does not begin in government buildings alone. It does not begin with speeches alone. And it certainly does not begin with slogans alone. Real change begins when individuals choose to live according to their conscience. It begins when people have the courage to stand for what is right even when doing so is difficult. It begins when individuals use their voices to defend those who have none. I hope future generations will build a world more just than the one we inherited. A world where human beings are valued because of their dignity rather than their position. A world where unity becomes stronger than division. A world where compassion becomes stronger than greed. A world where people recognize that their shared humanity matters more than the labels that separate them. The road towards such a future will never be easy. Every generation faces its own struggles. Every nation faces its own tests. But I remain convinced that people who preserve their dignity, remain united, and continue standing for truth possess the power to change their destiny. That belief has not left me. If anything, it has grown stronger. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson I carried away from that unexpected meeting in Johannesburg. Sometimes a conversation does not change your circumstances. Sometimes it does not change your career. Sometimes it does not change the world around you. Instead, it changes the way you see the world. And once that happens, everything else begins to look different. That is what happened to me. A simple conversation became a lasting reflection. A private exchange became a personal lesson. And a question about faith became a reminder that leadership, at its best, is ultimately about serving others. If there is one thought I would leave with you today, it is this: never underestimate the power of a sincere conversation. You never know when a single honest exchange may alter the direction of an entire journey. And if you also believe that our future can be more just, more compassionate, and more hopeful than our present, I invite you to leave a word of encouragement and continue walking this path with us. Because hope does not belong to those who wait for miracles. Hope belongs to those who continue working, serving, and striving to build a better future for the generations that follow. Sometimes that future begins with nothing more than one conversation. And for me, it began with a question I will never forget.